Hi boys and girls, Mrs. Adams here. I'm going to read a story to you today, and it's Curious George's Apple Harvest. I thought this was the perfect story since our letter of the day is letter A, and A starts the word apple. All right, let's read our story. Curious George Apple Harvest. It was harvest time. Mr. Rankins needed help picking his apples. George and his friend, the man with the yellow hat, were happy to lend a helping hand. Orfoot. Mr. Rankins explained that they needed to collect every apple. I'm going to join the Mrs. Roundback, he said. Once you fill that cart, you can unload it into the washing trough. Mr. Rankins took the cart full of apples to the barn and dumped them into the water. It must be their bath time, George thought. George climbed up the branches, collected the shiny red apples in his friend's hat, and put them into the cart. What fun! High up in the tree, he saw Jumpy Squirrel picking apples too. George decided to help. He took Jumpy's apple and tossed it into the cart with the rest of Mr. Rankin's apples. But Jumpy wanted that apple for himself. He leaped into to take it back, and George tried to stop him. Easy now, George. That lever releases all the apples, said his friend. George looked at the lever. He thought it was an excellent way to get Jumpy out of the cart. George, no! George pulled the lever with Jumpy tumbled out along with all of the apples. That's okay, said his friend with a sigh. We can gather them up again. But Jumpy had found his apple, and he ran to hide in the barn. George decided to follow him. Oh no. George looked around the inside of the barn in wonder. There were all sorts of things to climb on and swing from. It must be some kind of monkey playground. But George was not here to play. He had to get that apple from Jumpy. If only it weren't so dark in the barn. He found the light switch and flipped it on. Is he listening, boys and girls? I don't think he should touch things he doesn't know. Everything moved. It was a machine, not a playground. George wondered how it worked. He watched the bucket scoop up the apples. He decided they must carry the apples high away from squirrels. But wait, where was Jumpy? There he was. Jumpy still had an apple he took from the cart. George chased Jumpy, grabbed the apple, and threw it into the bin, high out of reach. Suddenly, the machine stopped. George found a button and pushed it. The machine started again. This time, all of the parts started working, including the moving belt. But when he looked up, he saw all of Mrs. Rankin's beautiful apples being chopped into bits. The chopped up apples dropped into a giant barrel, and a lid was lowered tightly on top of them. Too tightly, liquid began pouring out of the barrel. What a mess! George had an idea. He ran up and put his mouth under the liquid. It tasted good, a lot like apples. But there was too much of it. Luckily, he saw some empty containers. What do you think they're making? I bet some of you remember if you went on our field trip. George scrambled to put the containers on the moving belt fast enough to catch the liquid. Then he looked down at the end of the belt and saw the containers falling onto the floor. Uh-oh! George ran to catch them. Then he needed to stop the machine. Soon he had filled all of the containers, but the golden liquid continued to pour out. He looked around for another container and saw a big pair of rubber boots. At last, the last boot was filled, the liquid stopped pouring out, and the machine stopped. Whew! The farmers and George's friend appeared in the doorway. Well, I'll be, Mr. Rankin exclaimed. George froze. The Rankins would surely be upset that he ruined all of their apples. George, says Mrs. Rankin as she rushed up to him, you've done a fantastic job. All of our cider already pressed and bottled? Why, thank you. Do you think George knew he was helping? This is some machine, said the man with the yellow hat. See, the apples are washed here, Mrs. Rankin explained. Then they are lifted up to the chopper because chopped apples give more juice. The juice is pressed out in the apples and then bottled. George had not ruined the apples after all. He turned them into cider. Mrs. Rankin handed the apples to George. "Here, you've earned it," he said. George knew someone who wanted that apple more than he did. He had enough apples for one day. Who did he give it to? His friend Jumpy, right? The end. I hope you enjoyed our story today and look back tomorrow for another wonderful story. Miss you, boys and girls.